Imagine getting handcuffed on your way to school, for no reason. Two black teenagers thought they were just another case of racial profiling. But what happened next? No one saw it coming. A powerful man made one call, and suddenly, the cop who thought he had all the power was the one begging for mercy. Stay tuned. The morning sun cast a golden hue over Pine Creek, Texas, a town where the past clung stubbornly to the present. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that came with familiarity, where everyone knew everyone. And strangers stood out. Mark Reynolds had spent years patrolling these roads, watching over the town like a guardian. He prided himself on maintaining order, on knowing who belonged and who didn't. As he drove past Lincoln High, the most prestigious school in the area, he caught sight of two young black boys walking toward the entrance. Their uniforms were crisp, their posture upright, yet something about them didn't sit right with him. He slowed the car, narrowing his eyes. His hand instinctively reached for the radio. But he hesitated. The boys kept walking, unaware of the scrutiny. Mark flicked on his patrol lights and pulled up beside them. The sudden flash of red and blue startled them. They exchanged quick glances before stopping. Mark rolled down the window, his voice firm. "Let me see your student IDs." One of the boys, the taller one, stepped forward cautiously. "We forgot them at home, sir, but we go here. I'm Jordan Carter, and this is my brother, Jaden. We can call our parents if you need." Mark cut him off. "And your parents can afford to send you here?" The words carried the weight of doubt, an insinuation wrapped in condescension. Jordan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered, something Mark couldn't quite place. Jaden shifted uneasily beside him. Mark exhaled sharply, reaching for his radio. "I've got two possible trespassers at Lincoln High. Might be attempting to gain unlawful access. Send backup." Jordan stiffened. "Sir, that's not necessary. We're telling you the truth." Mark stepped out of his car, the weight of his badge pressing against his chest. "Hands where I can see them." Confusion flickered across their faces before frustration set in. But they complied. In one practiced motion, Mark pulled out his handcuffs and secured them around Jordan's wrists first. Then Jaden's. The metallic click rang louder than it should have in the morning air. "Get in the car." His tone left no room for argument. As he shut the door, sealing them in the backseat of his patrol car, the radio crackled with urgency. "Officer Reynolds, stand down immediately. Those boys are Judge Richard Carter's sons." A sudden tightness gripped Mark's chest. His fingers hovered over the radio, the realization sinking in like a slow, inevitable tide. The fluorescent lights in the Pine Creek police station hummed faintly, casting a pale glow over the booking desk. Mark Reynolds stood behind the counter, his fingers moving mechanically as he filled out the necessary paperwork. His mind, however, was elsewhere. The radio call still echoed in his ears, words carrying a weight that pressed against his chest like an anvil. Across from him, Jordan and Jaden Carter sat on a hard wooden bench, their wrists still bound in metal cuffs. They didn't fidget, didn't plead, just sat there in eerie silence, exchanging only brief glances. Their composure unsettled Mark in a way he couldn't quite name. Before he could finish processing the arrest, the sharp ring of a desk phone cut through the room. Officer Grant, a stocky man with graying hair, picked it up, but his expression changed the moment he heard the voice on the other end. His gaze flicked to Mark before he turned away, lowering his voice. After a tense exchange, Grant hung up and walked over, his usual arrogance replaced with unease. "You need to release them. Now." Mark frowned. "What?" Grant leaned in. "That was the mayor's office. Judge Carter is on the warpath. If you don't want your badge hanging by a thread, uncuff them and let them go." The words sent a chill through Mark's spine. His jaw tightened as he turned to look at the two boys again. He had arrested hundreds of people in his career, followed the same procedures time and time again, and no one had ever received a call from the mayor demanding their release. But this wasn't just anyone. His hands felt heavy as he reached for the keys clipped to his belt. He crouched down, unlocking Jordan's cuffs first, then Jaden's. As the metal restraints fell away, Jaden rubbed his wrists, but Jordan simply stood up, adjusting his sleeves with careful precision. Mark cleared his throat, forcing his voice to stay even. This was just a misunderstanding. Jordan met his gaze, his face unreadable. Then, in a voice so steady it barely felt like a reaction at all, he said, "Your apology means nothing. What matters is what you did." Something inside Mark twisted, an unfamiliar tightness gripping his chest. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Before he could find them, the door swung open. Two men in dark suits strode in. One of them, a well-known local attorney, and the other, an aide from the mayor's office. Without a word, they ushered Jordan and Jaden out of the station, leaving Mark standing there, still holding the cuffs. Behind him, the murmurs began. Other officers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others smirking knowingly. Grant crossed his arms. "You really screwed up this time, Reynolds." Mark swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth, but before he could respond, another voice called his name. "Reynolds, in my office." Now, Captain Russell stood in the hallway, his face stone cold. Minutes later, Mark sat across from him. The door closed behind them. Russell exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This is a disaster," he muttered. "The judge is furious. The mayor is furious. The department doesn't need this kind of attention." Mark straightened in his chair. "I was following protocol." Russell's gaze sharpened. "You were following your instincts. And look where that got you. We can't afford a scandal. So, here's what's going to happen. You're being reassigned." Mark stiffened. "To where?" Russell's lips pressed into a thin line. "South Side." Silence settled between them. Mark leaned forward, his voice low. "You're sending me to patrol the worst part of town as punishment?" Russell didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. "You'll report to Officer Samuel Brown. Effective immediately." Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. South Side, a predominantly black neighborhood, a place he had spent his career avoiding. His grip on the armrests tightened, but he knew arguing was pointless. The message was clear. This wasn't a reassignment. It was exile. The air felt different in Southside. It wasn't just the heat that pressed down heavier here or the cracked sidewalks that told a different story from the well-maintained streets of Pine Creek's other neighborhoods. It was the way people moved, the way their eyes flicked toward Mark as he stepped out of his patrol car. Their gazes unwavering, unapologetic. They weren't scared of him. That alone made his skin crawl. The Southside police station was smaller than the one he had come from, with outdated furniture and a lingering smell of old coffee. The bulletin board behind the front desk was cluttered with missing persons reports, most of them featuring black and Hispanic faces. Mark barely had time to take it all in before a voice called out to him. "You Reynolds?" He turned to find a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark uniform leaning against a desk, arms crossed. His badge read Samuel Brown. "I'm the guy stuck babysitting you," Brown continued, pushing off the desk and walking toward him. "So let's get one thing straight. I don't care what kind of officer you were in the North Side. Here, you follow my lead, got it?" Mark straightened his posture. "I've been doing this for a long time." Brown nodded, unimpressed. "That's so? Then you should know better than to pull the kind of stunt that got you sent here." Mark clenched his jaw but said nothing. He wasn't about to defend himself to a man who had no idea what it was like working in Pine Creek's real police force, where respect still meant something. Brown picked up a clipboard from the desk. "First shift, traffic duty. Try not to shoot anyone for walking in the wrong direction." Mark grabbed the clipboard from him, his grip tightening around the edges. He could already tell this was going to be hell. For the next several days, he was given nothing but menial tasks. Standing at intersections, directing traffic, handling noise complaints. Work that any rookie could do. The insult wasn't lost on him. He had been a respected officer, someone people listened to. But here, in Southside, he was just another uniform. The worst part was the way people looked at him. He walked into a small cafe one afternoon, needing a break from the suffocating heat. The scent of fresh coffee and fried dough filled the air. But instead of the usual chatter and clinking of mugs, silence stretched as he stepped inside. Conversations died mid-sentence. A group of older men at a corner table glanced at him, then resumed talking in hushed tones. A woman behind the counter raised an eyebrow, as if waiting to see what he would do next. He ordered a coffee, ignoring the whispers behind him. As he waited, His gaze moved around the room, catching bits and pieces of the murmured conversation. Then, his eyes landed on someone familiar. Jordan Carter sat alone near the window, a book open in front of him. His expression was calm, unreadable, but there was no mistaking the way he looked directly at Mark, like he had been waiting for this moment. Mark tensed. He wasn't sure if he should acknowledge him or walk away, but Jordan made the decision for him. "You don't think you did anything wrong, do you?" The question hit Mark like a punch to the gut, but he didn't let it show. His fingers curled around the cup of coffee that had just been set in front of him. But suddenly, he wasn't so sure he wanted it anymore. The radio crackled in the patrol car, interrupting the quiet tension between Mark and Samuel Brown. Disturbance reported at Morrison's Market. Possible altercation in progress. Units respond. Brown picked up the radio. Unit 17 en route. Mark glanced at him. "What's Morrison's Market?" "Local grocery store," Brown said, making a sharp turn down a side street. "Owned by a guy named Frank Morrison. Calls the cops for damn near everything." Mark scoffed. "So we're responding to a shoplifter?" Could be nothing. Either way, we handle it right." When they arrived, a small crowd had already gathered outside. The market sat on the corner of a narrow street, wedged between a laundromat and a barber shop. A hand-painted sign above the entrance was peeling at the edges, and the glass windows reflected the setting sun. Mark stepped out first, his eyes immediately locking onto a group of black teenagers standing near the entrance. One of them, a tall boy in a gray hoodie, was gesturing animatedly while Morrison, a wiry white man in his 60s, stood in front of them with his arms crossed, face tight with anger. As Mark approached, his hand instinctively rested on his belt. "Step back," he said, his voice firm. The boy in the hoodie turned, his expression shifting from frustration to disbelief. "Step back from what? We didn't do anything." Mark took another step forward. "I won't ask again." Before the tension could thicken, Brown moved in beside him, raising a hand toward the teens. "All right, let's take a breath here," he said, his voice even. "Tell me what's going on." Morrison exhaled sharply. "They've been loitering outside my store for over an hour, making customers nervous. When I asked them to leave, they started getting aggressive." The boy scoffed. "Man, we weren't doing anything but waiting for my grandma to come out." Mark narrowed his eyes. "Then why didn't you leave when the owner asked you to?" "Because we have the right to stand here," the boy shot back. Mark felt his patience thinning. "You don't have the right to cause a disturbance." Brown's voice cut in. "Did they steal anything, Mr. Morrison?" Morrison hesitated. "Not exactly, but they were." "Did they threaten you?" Morrison shifted his stance. "They got loud." Brown gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. "So no theft, no threats, just standing outside your store?" Morrison's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Mark's irritation deepened. "So we're here because you just didn't like them standing outside your store?" The crowd murmured. The teens looked at each other, a quiet sense of vindication passing between them. Brown turned to the boys. "All right, fellas, you made your point. Now let's keep things moving. You can wait for your grandma across the street." The boy in the hoodie hesitated, then exhaled sharply and nodded. The group started walking away, muttering under their breath. Morrison shook his head. "This is exactly why this neighborhood's a mess." Brown's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. "Call us if there's an actual crime, Mr. Morrison." Back in the patrol car, Mark stared straight ahead, gripping the wheel. "So we just let them walk?" Brown sighed. "Let them walk? You mean not arrest them for standing outside a store?" Mark didn't answer. As he reached for the ignition, a soft voice spoke from outside his window. "Officer Brown." A black woman in her 60s stood beside the car, her eyes steady, her hands folded in front of her. "Yeah, Miss Lillian?" Brown asked. She glanced at Mark before returning her gaze to Brown. "You keep an eye on your partner. We don't need another George Floyd here." Mark's breath hitched, his grip on the wheel tightened. She walked away without another word. Mark sat still, staring at the dashboard. For the first time, he wasn't just angry, he felt like a villain. The night air in Southside felt different. It was thick, heavy, carrying the weight of a neighborhood that never truly rested. Streetlights buzzed overhead, their flickering glow barely keeping the darkness at bay. Mark had spent years patrolling at night. But something about this shift felt off. Maybe it was the way people lingered on their porches as he drove by, watching him in silence. Maybe it was the way conversations hushed when he stepped out of his car. Here, he wasn't a figure of authority. He was an outsider. And worse, he was unwanted. He turned onto a narrow alleyway between two old apartment buildings, his boots echoing against the cracked pavement. Trash cans lined the walls, the faint scent of stale beer and fried food hanging in the air. That was when he felt it. Eyes on him. Mark slowed his steps, glancing to his right. A small group of young men stood just outside the reach of the streetlights, half hidden in the shadows. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, hands in their pockets, their expressions unreadable, but something about the way they watched him made the hairs on his neck stand up. He exhaled, tightening his grip on his flashlight. "You got business back here?" His voice cut through the quiet. The tallest of the group, a kid in a black hoodie, took a slow step forward. "You got a reason to ask?" Mark straightened, posture rigid. "This alley's not a hangout spot. Move along." Another boy, younger looking but just as steady, pulled out his phone and aimed the camera directly at Mark. "Look at this, y'all," he said, voice dripping with something between amusement and defiance. "Officer Reynolds, right? You gonna arrest us for walking, too?" Mark's jaw tightened. He took a step forward, forcing himself not to look at the phone. "I asked you to move." The boy holding the phone smirked. "You ain't asking, you're telling." Like always, Mark reached for his radio, but the movement only made the group stiffen. The boy in the hoodie tilted his head. "What you gonna do, officer? Call backup? Are you gonna handle us like you handled those Carter boys?" The words struck him like a slap. Mark opened his mouth, ready to snap back, but something stopped him. The phone, the way it recorded everything. He wasn't in control of this situation. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one holding the power. The realization made his stomach turn. He had been in hundreds of situations like this before, where his badge meant obedience, where people knew to listen or face the consequences. But now, these kids weren't afraid. They were watching him, waiting. His radio crackled. "Unit 17, status check." Mark's fingers twitched, hovering over the call button. He could escalate this. He could make an arrest, justify it however he needed to. But deep down, a gnawing feeling told him he had already lost this battle. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Laughter followed him down the alley. By the time he made it back to his car, his hands were shaking. He hated himself for it. The next morning, his worst fears were confirmed. His video, was already spreading across social media. The comments were relentless, the footage clear. Mark Reynolds, the officer who arrested two innocent boys, now harassing another group of black teenagers without cause. The narrative was forming, and for once, he couldn't control it. When he stepped into the precinct, the shift was undeniable. Conversations stopped when he walked in. Officers who used to nod at him barely acknowledged him now. Even Grant, a guy who used to crack jokes with him, kept his distance. Then came the call to the captain's office. Captain Russell leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You're making this department look bad, Reynolds." Mark tensed. "I didn't do anything wrong." Russell scoffed. "Doesn't matter. The court of public opinion thinks you did. And if you screw up again, I won't have a choice. You'll be out." Mark left the office feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. Mark drove through Pine Creek with his window halfway down, letting the crisp air cut through the stale tension in his car. The past few days had been suffocating. Whispers in the precinct, the wary glances from officers who once had his back. The video from Southside was still circulating, and though he hadn't faced any formal disciplinary action, it was clear he had become a problem. He wasn't sure why he found himself heading toward Lincoln High. Maybe it was habit, or maybe it was something else. Something unsettled in his chest that he couldn't quite name. As he approached the school, he noticed a small group gathered near the student parking lot. A few kids stood around a sleek black sedan, their voices low, their postures tense. Even from a distance, Mark could see the bright streaks of spray paint scrawled across the car's side. He pulled over, stepping out before he fully processed what he was looking at. The words were large, dripping red paint still fresh. Slurs, accusations, ugly, hateful messages sprawled across the Carter boys' car like a brand burned into metal. Mark clenched his jaw. He knew that someone would try to pin this on him. The murmuring students turned as he approached. A few took cautious steps back, while others pulled out their phones. The air was thick with expectation, like they were waiting to see what he'd do. Then he saw him. Jordan Carter stood on the other side of the car, hands in his pockets, watching Mark with an expression that was impossible to read. Mark exhaled through his nose. "Did you report it?" Jordan tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "Not yet." Mark looked back at the graffiti, then at Jordan. "You know I had nothing to do with this." Jordan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I know." The answer caught Mark off guard. He had expected sarcasm, maybe even outright blame, but Jordan's voice was calm, steady. Mark crossed his arms. "Then you should report it. Get the cameras checked. Whoever did this should." Jordan interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "It doesn't matter who did it." Mark frowned. "Of course, it does." Jordan took a step closer, keeping his eyes locked on Mark's. "Whoever did this wants people like you and me to react exactly the way they expect. They want me to be angry. They want you to feel cornered." Mark stiffened. Jordan glanced at the watching crowd, then back at him. "Not everyone is against you," he said, "but if you really want to know who's on your side, stop looking where you always have." Mark felt something tighten in his chest. He wanted to ask what that meant, but Jordan was already walking past him, pulling out his phone, likely to call his father or the school. Mark stood there for a long time, staring at the hateful words still dripping down the car door. By noon, the story was everywhere. News vans showed up outside the school. Commentators speculated about whether the incident was connected to Mark's history with the Carter boys. Some painted Jordan and Jaden as victims of a broken system, while others accused them of exaggerating racial tensions for attention. Mark's name came up more than once. Some headlines framed him as the officer caught in the middle of an unfair culture war. Others implied he was the catalyst for it. When he arrived at the precinct later that afternoon, he could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. Officers he once considered allies barely made eye contact. Some whispered as he walked by. Mark had spent years believing he understood control, that his badge gave him authority, stability. For the first time, he realized he had none. The atmosphere inside the Southside precinct was thick with unspoken tension. Mark had felt it before. The weight of eyes lingering too long. The silence that stretched just a little too far when he entered a room. But today, it was worse. He wasn't just an outsider anymore, he was a liability. As he walked toward the conference room, snippets of hushed conversations reached his ears. His name floated through the air, laced with skepticism, caution. He clenched his jaw and pushed open the door. Inside, a handful of officers sat around a long table, their faces serious. At the head of the room, Captain Russell stood with his arms crossed, looking every bit as exhausted as the situation demanded. Beside him, Samuel Brown leaned against the wall, watching Mark as if already anticipating his reaction. Russell wasted no time. "We've got a problem," he said. "The situation with the Carter boys and the vandalized car has turned into a media firestorm. Now, every incident involving this department is under a microscope." Mark set his jaw. "I did my job. Did you?" Brown cut in, his voice calm but firm. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you keep making the same damn mistakes." Mark turned toward him, irritation flaring. "You think I wanted any of this? The media twisted everything. They don't care about facts. Just whatever makes the best headline." Brown pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "And what about before the headlines? Before the cameras? You ever stop to think maybe this isn't just bad luck?" Mark scoffed. "Oh, let me guess. I'm the problem. Not the kids pushing back against authority. Not the store owners calling in false reports. Just me." Brown studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You really don't get it, do you?" The room was silent. Russell sighed and rubbed his temples. "Enough. Look, the mayor's office is breathing down our necks. The DA is sniffing around. If we don't get ahead of this, someone's going to take the fall." Mark's stomach tightened. And you think that someone is me? Russell didn't answer. He didn't have to. Brown exhaled sharply. Mark, listen to me. If you keep digging your heels in, they'll bury you. This department will cut you loose to save itself. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. But he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. I've done nothing wrong. Brown studied him again, then turned toward the door. That's the problem. As he walked out, a file from his desk slipped off the edge, scattering papers onto the floor. Mark bent down to pick them up, intending to shove them back where they belonged, until a familiar name caught his eye. It was his. Frowning, he flipped through the pages. They weren't just reports, they were complaints, investigations, incidents dating back years, his arrests, his use of force reports, patterns he hadn't noticed before but now seemed impossible to ignore. And then, at the bottom of one of the pages, a note. Pending litigation. Reynolds listed among officers under review. His throat went dry. He grabbed another file, this one thicker, filled with names he recognized. Officers who had quietly left the force. A pattern of excessive force complaints buried beneath legal jargon. And there, near the most recent entries, another name. Richard Carter. Mark felt a chill crawl down his spine. The Carters weren't just at the center of a media storm. They were at the center of something much bigger. The night pressed down on Southside like a heavy blanket, thick with humidity and something else, something harder to name. Mark drove in silence, the rhythmic hum of his engine the only sound filling the patrol car. He was alone tonight. Brown had made that clear. I'm not riding with you, Brown had said before walking away. No explanation, no argument, just a firm decision, leaving Mark to navigate the streets on his own. Mark told himself he didn't care. He had done patrols alone for years. He didn't need Brown or anyone else watching over his shoulder. Still, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that things had changed. Southside wasn't like the neighborhoods he was used to. Here, people weren't afraid of the badge. The radio crackled, breaking the uneasy quiet. Suspicious activity reported near Oakwood and 4th. Unidentified group loitering near residences. Mark lifted the receiver. Unit 17 responding. He turned down a narrow street. The houses packed close together. Porch lights flickering in the distance. It didn't take long to spot them. A small group stood near the mouth of an alley. Shadows stretching long under the dim street lamp. His grip tightened on the wheel. He recognized two of them immediately. Jordan and Jaden Carter. They were speaking to three other young men. Their voices low but steady. Something inside Mark twisted. He didn't know why, but the sight of them there, at this hour, set off alarms in his mind. His gut told him they were up to something, though he had no proof, no real reason to believe it. He stepped out of his car, the weight of his badge pressing against his chest. Hands where I can see them, he ordered, his voice sharp. No one moved. Mark reached for his holster. His pulse was steady, but there was an edge of something he couldn't place. Anticipation. Maybe a need to regain control. Jaden glanced at his brother, then back at Mark. You serious? Jordan exhaled slowly. Then, with deliberate calm, he raised his hands. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. So this is where we are again? Mark hesitated, his fingers tightening around the grip of his gun. Jordan took a step forward, just enough to meet his gaze. You're not afraid of us, Officer Reynolds. You're afraid of what happens when you don't have control. The words landed like a punch to the gut. For the first time, Mark didn't know what to say. Then, from behind him, the sharp wail of a police siren cut through the night. A second patrol car pulled up, tires grinding against the asphalt. The driver's door swung open, and Samuel Brown stepped out. Mark didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He already knew what was coming. Brown's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a warning. If you pull that trigger, Reynolds, you'll never get the chance to take it back. Mark felt his breath catch. He looked at Jordan again, at the quiet defiance in his eyes. Then, slowly, his hand relaxed. The gun lowered, but he knew, they all knew, that nothing about this night would be forgotten. Mark sat in the cold, windowless conference room of the Pine Creek police station, his back straight, hands clasped tightly in front of him. Across the table, Captain Frank Dalton leaned back in his chair, arms folded, watching him with the unreadable expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. The meeting had been called first thing in the morning, before the media had time to sink its teeth into last night's incident. The room smelled of burnt coffee and stale sweat, the air thick with a quiet tension that made Mark's skin itch. Dalton exhaled through his nose. "Tell me what the hell you were thinking." Mark clenched his jaw. "I was doing my job." Dalton let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That right? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you pulled your gun on the same damn kids that got you into trouble the first time. And lucky for you, Brown showed up before you made things worse." Mark felt heat rise to his face. "I assessed a potential threat. I reacted accordingly." Dalton's amusement faded, his voice lowered, edged with something colder. "Reynolds, listen to me carefully. I don't care what you thought you saw. I don't care what you think you were doing. What I care about is that you're dragging this department into a mess we don't need." Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. "So what? We're just going to let them do whatever they want? Let them walk all over us?" Dalton leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You don't have to like them. But you do have to play smart. The system isn't about right or wrong. It's about survival. And right now, you're not making it easy for anyone to protect you." The words hit harder than Mark expected. Protect him. Not because they believed he was right. Not because they thought he had done his job correctly. But because his mistakes, his presence, had become an inconvenience. Dalton sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're not being suspended, yet, but if you don't learn to manage yourself better, you're going to find out real fast that this department doesn't have a problem cutting dead weight." Mark felt something cold settle in his stomach. As he left the room, Brown was waiting for him in the hallway, arms crossed, face unreadable. "You think they're looking out for you?" Brown asked. Mark's hands curled into fists. "I don't need a lecture." Brown tilted his head slightly. "Not a lecture, just a warning. You keep thinking this system works for you, that it's going to have your back no matter what. But one day, you're going to realize it only protects itself. And when that day comes, you better know where you stand." Mark didn't respond. He just walked past him, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. By the time he reached his car, his phone buzzed with a new message. A link, no sender. Frowning, he opened it. It led to an online post, an anonymous leak. His blood ran cold as he scrolled. A list of names, officers under internal review. His was on it. And worse, so were names that outranked him. The drive to the outskirts of Pine Creek was long and lonely. Mark's hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, his thoughts circling like vultures over a fresh kill. The anonymous message had been brief, an address and a time. Nothing more. He should have ignored it. But after seeing his name on that leaked list, something inside him had shifted. He needed answers. The road turned from pavement to dirt, dust kicking up in his headlights as he approached the destination. The building loomed ahead, a rusted-out warehouse, long abandoned, its metal siding battered by time and neglect. The place felt wrong. Still, he stepped out of the car. The heavy door groaned as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the scent of oil and old wood lingering. A single hanging bulb flickered, barely illuminating the figure standing near the back. The man was older, his hair more gray than brown, his face worn like an old leather jacket. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "David Keller?" Mark asked, his voice steady. The man nodded. "Figured you'd come." Mark stepped closer, keeping a careful distance. "Why am I here?" Keller let out a dry chuckle. "Because you're in deeper than you think. And you're not gonna like what you find when you start looking." Mark folded his arms. "You were a cop." Keller's expression darkened. "Yeah, and look where that got me." Silence stretched between them before Keller sighed and reached into his pocket. Pulling out a folded piece of paper, he handed it to Mark. Mark unfolded it. "Names, dates, charges. They're fixing arrests," Keller said, cherry-picking cases to shift voting patterns, keeping certain communities afraid, certain politicians in power. Mark's stomach tightened. He scanned the names, recognizing a few of them. Officers he'd worked with, arrests he'd made. "You're telling me this department is just a piece of it?" Keller cut in. You think they're protecting you? They're protecting themselves. And if you get in their way, they'll bury you. Mark's jaw clenched. Why tell me? Keller smirked. Because I was you once. Thought I was untouchable. Thought I was on the right side. His voice hardened. Then one day, I wasn't useful anymore. And I found out what happens when the system decides you're a liability. Mark held his gaze. And what happens? Keller's smirk faded. You disappear. The words sat heavy between them. Before Mark could respond, a sound outside made them both tense. Tires on gravel. Keller swore under his breath. You need to go. Now. Mark hesitated, but the urgency in Keller's eyes pushed him into motion. He made it out the side door, moving quickly toward his car. But before he could reach it, two figures stepped into his path. Dark suits, blank expressions, not local cops. One of them, a tall man with a clipped haircut, spoke first. Detective Reynolds. Mark's pulse quickened. The other man pulled out a badge. Internal Affairs. We need to have a word. The first man took a step closer. You're next on our list. The interrogation room was colder than Mark expected. Not physically, though the air conditioning hummed steadily overhead, but in the way that stripped a man down to nothing. The metal table between him and the two federal agents was scratched and worn. A silent reminder of how many people had sat here before him. Their fates decided in these four walls. Rachel Torres sat with her back straight, hands folded in front of her, a model of controlled authority. Her partner, Daniel Briggs, leaned back slightly, but his sharp eyes never left Mark. They had played this game before. Torres broke the silence first. Detective Reynolds, do you know why you're here? Mark exhaled through his nose, leveling his gaze at her. I can take a guess. Briggs tapped a folder on the table. You've had a rough few weeks, haven't you? He flipped it open, scanning the contents. First, the Carter boys, then the Southside Patrol incident. And let's not forget last night, you were seen meeting with David Keller. Mark didn't flinch, but his fingers curled into his lap. They knew everything. Torres leaned forward slightly. We're not here for those incidents. Though, we're here because you're a part of something much bigger. Mark clenched his jaw. I don't know what you're talking about. Torres slid a second folder across the table. Then maybe this will jog your memory. He hesitated before opening it. Inside were pages of internal reports, complaints, excessive force claims, allegations of falsified evidence. His name appeared more than once. But the deeper he flipped, the more familiar the names became. Frank Dalton, other high-ranking officers, men who had been in this department longer than he had been alive. Mark felt his pulse quicken. What is this? Briggs crossed his arms. This is the reason we're sitting here. We have enough evidence to expose a long history of cover-ups in Pine Creek PD. But to bring it all down, we need someone on the inside. Torres met Mark's gaze. That's where you come in. Mark let out a bitter laugh. So that's the deal? You want me to turn on my own department? Torres didn't blink. We want you to tell the truth. Mark shook his head. You think I'm going to help you take down my entire career? Torres leaned in. If you don't, you won't have a career left. Mark felt the weight of the room press against his chest. Briggs studied him. You have two choices, Reynolds. 1. You work with us. Help us take down Dalton and the people pulling the strings. Or 2. You take the fall for all of it when the time comes. Silence stretched between them. Mark wanted to argue, to fight back, but he knew the truth. They had him. Torres' voice softened, but it carried the finality of a closing door. This system isn't loyal to you, Reynolds. It never was. Mark stared at the pages in front of him, his mind racing. Before he could speak, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message. No name, no number, just 4 words. Don't be stupid. We're watching. Mark felt his stomach drop. Torres and Briggs exchanged a look, clearly noticing his reaction. Mark didn't just have to worry about Ia. He had enemies inside his own department. The underground parking lot smelled of damp concrete and motor oil. Dim overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows that made the space feel even more isolated than it already was. Mark leaned against the hood of his car, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He had called Brown, told him they needed to talk somewhere private. This was the best he could do. A familiar engine rumbled down the ramp. Brown's unmarked patrol car rolled to a stop a few spaces away. The veteran officer stepped out, his eyes scanning the area before settling on Mark. "All right," Brown said, shutting the door behind him. "What's so important it couldn't wait?" Mark hesitated. The words felt heavy, like once he said them, there was no turning back. He glanced around one last time, then exhaled. "Internal Affairs is building a case against the department. They want me to testify." Brown's expression didn't change. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. "And what did you tell them?" Mark shifted his weight. "I told them nothing. Yet." Brown studied him, his jaw tight. "But you're thinking about it." Mark swallowed. "They have files, complaints, proof that Dalton and others have been covering things up for years." He ran a hand through his hair. "And my name's in there too." Brown exhaled slowly. "Yeah, figured as much." Mark frowned. "You knew?" "I didn't know specifics," Brown admitted, "but I've been in this job long enough to recognize when a system is rotting from the inside." He folded his arms. "The question isn't whether Ia is telling the truth. The question is, what are you gonna do about it?" Mark felt his stomach tighten. "If I cooperate, I lose everything. My career, my reputation." Brown stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And if you don't, you lose something bigger. You lose yourself." The words hit harder than Mark expected. He thought back to the past few weeks. The Carter boys. The way his own department had turned against him. The realization that he had pulled his gun on two kids who weren't even a threat. Had he really been blind for so long? Brown must have seen something shift in his face because his tone softened. "You've spent your whole life believing the badge made you one of the good guys. But a badge doesn't mean a damn thing if you're standing on the wrong side." Mark clenched his jaw. "You're saying I should just betray everyone I've ever worked with?" "I'm saying," Brown said slowly, "you need to decide if protecting the system is worth more than doing what's right." Silence stretched between them. Brown sighed and ran a hand over his face. "Look, I get it. You're scared. I would be too. But you don't get to play dumb anymore. The second you saw those files, you became part of this. You can either act, or you can let them decide your fate for you." Mark's chest tightened. Before he could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the parking garage. A gunshot. Brown staggered, a look of shock flashing across his face before his knees buckled. Mark's heart slammed against his ribs. "Brown!" He lunged forward, catching him just before he hit the ground. Blood spread across Brown's shirt, warm and thick against Mark's hands. Tires screeched in the distance. Mark snapped his head up just in time to see a dark sedan peeling out of the lot. Someone had gotten to them first. And Mark knew he was next. The fluorescent lights in Pine Creek General buzzed faintly, casting a cold glow over the linoleum floors. Mark stood just outside the intensive care unit, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears. Through the small window, he could see Samuel Brown lying still, a tangle of IV lines snaking from his arms. The steady beep of the heart monitor the only sign that he was still hanging on. The doctors had said it was touch and go. The bullet had torn through his side, missing any vital organs by inches. But the blood loss had been severe. Mark's hands clenched at his sides. This hadn't been a random act of violence. Brown had been targeted, and Mark knew why. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, barely glancing at the caller ID before answering. "Reynolds. Get to the station, now." Captain Dalton's voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. Mark exhaled sharply and turned away from the window. He gave one last glance toward Brown before heading for the exit. The drive back to the precinct was tense. Pine Creek's streets felt different now. Every passing car, every pair of eyes lingering a second too long set his nerves on edge. He wasn't paranoid, he was being watched. When he walked into the station, the air was thick with something unspoken. Conversations paused. Officers who once gave him nods of acknowledgement barely glanced in his direction. Dalton was waiting for him. Without a word, the captain gestured for Mark to follow. He led him down the hall to a meeting room, shutting the door behind them. For a moment, Dalton just stared at him, the lines on his face deeper than usual. Then he sighed. "You should let this go." Mark's stomach tightened. "Let what go?" Dalton leaned against the table, arms crossed. Brown got himself involved in something he shouldn't have. And now, so are you. Mark felt a sharp heat rise in his chest. Someone tried to kill him. Dalton's expression didn't change. And if you're not careful, you'll be next. Silence stretched between them. Dalton pushed off the table and walked toward the door. No witnesses. No problem. Walk away. Reynolds, that's the smartest thing you can do. Then he was gone, leaving Mark standing there, the weight of the words pressing down on him. His fingers curled into fists. They wanted him to forget, to pretend none of this was happening. But he couldn't. When he returned to his locker, he found it slightly ajar. Frowning, he pulled it open. A plain manila envelope sat on the top shelf. No name, no markings. He picked it up, his pulse kicking up a notch. Inside, he found a small USB drive. His breath caught, plugging it into his laptop in his car. The screen flickered to life, revealing grainy security footage. The timestamp was from last night. The location, a parking garage. Mark's throat went dry as the image became clear. Brown standing by his car. A dark figure stepping from the shadows. Then the gunshot. The shooter turned toward the camera for half a second. Enough for Mark to see his face. John Tate, a fellow officer, a man Mark had worked with for years. A man who reported directly to Dalton. Mark exhaled shakily, gripping the steering wheel with both hands. If he stayed silent, he'd be next. The parking lot was nearly silent, except for the distant hum of a highway and the occasional flicker of a faulty street lamp. Mark stood by his car, his fingers tightening around the small USB drive in his pocket. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, like a loaded gun. Ready to go off, a car pulled in from the far end of the lot, headlights briefly cutting through the darkness before shutting off. Rachel Torres stepped out, her silhouette sharp against the dim glow of a street lamp. She walked toward him, her posture steady, but her eyes scanning the area, always alert. "You have it?" she asked. Mark nodded, pulling the drive from his pocket and holding it out. "Everything's on here. The shooter was John Tate. One of ours. And Dalton has to be involved." Torres took the drive, tucking it into her jacket. "This is enough to start pulling them down. But you understand what this means, right?" Mark swallowed. "Yeah." Torres took a step closer. "When you choose this path, there's no going back. You'll be testifying against your own. That makes you more dangerous to them than IA, the media, or anyone else." Mark exhaled, rubbing his fingers over his jaw. "Brown almost died for this. If I don't act, it's only a matter of time before someone else does." Torres studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll be in touch soon." Mark turned toward his car, his mind racing with everything that had just been set in motion. He had spent years believing in the system, trusting that as long as he followed the rules, the badge would protect him. But now, the only thing protecting him was the truth, and that truth had just made him a target. As he pulled onto the road, he caught sight of something in his rearview mirror. Headlights. A car. Following too closely. Mark's grip on the wheel tightened. He changed lanes. The car followed. His pulse quickened. Then, a sharp crack. The driver's side window exploded, glass shattering across his lap. Mark swerved hard, tires screeching against the pavement as he fought for control. A second shot rang out, striking the metal just above his door. Someone was trying to kill him. The council chambers at Pine Creek City Hall were packed. The tension in the air was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations. Local politicians, community leaders, and officers from the department sat in stiff silence, their faces a mix of concern and calculation. The media had arrived in full force, cameras positioned at every angle, ready to capture whatever happened next. Mark sat near the front, his side aching from the wound he'd bandaged himself the night before. The bullet hadn't hit anything vital, but it was a reminder. Whoever had tried to kill him wasn't finished. Rachel Torres stood at the podium, her presence steady, composed. "This department has operated in secrecy for too long," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "Tonight, that changes." The large screen behind her flickered to life. The room went still as the footage began playing. A grainy, black and white security video from the parking garage. Samuel Brown standing by his car. A shadow moving toward him. Then the gunshot. The frame froze just as the shooter turned toward the camera. John Tate. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. A few gasps. Someone cursed under their breath. Mark kept his eyes trained on the front of the room, where Captain Frank Dalton sat stone-faced, his fingers laced together on the table in front of him. Torres let the noise settle before she spoke again. Officer John Tate carried out this attack, but he wasn't acting alone. She turned slightly, motioning toward the officers in the room. Someone gave the order. Mark stood. His voice was hoarse but clear. Frank Dalton. All eyes turned to the captain. Dalton didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose like a man who had seen this coming. Slowly, he rose to his feet. This is ridiculous. His voice was calm, measured. Tate was a rogue officer. Nothing more. You're reaching. Torres raised an eyebrow. Reaching? She pulled a folder from the table, flipping it open. Bank transactions, phone records, internal emails. You ordered the hit on Brown. She looked up, her expression unreadable. And you tried to have Reynolds killed, too. Dalton's lips pressed into a thin line. Mark took a step closer. You used us. You used me. We weren't cops to you. We were pawns. You built your career on fear and corruption. And you expected everyone to play along. Dalton shook his head, smirking slightly. And yet you did, Reynolds. For years. Right up until you got scared. He exhaled, tilting his head. Tell me, do you really think this changes anything? A pair of uniformed officers stepped forward, handcuffs glinting under the overhead lights. Dalton's smirk didn't fade. As they pulled his arms behind his back, he glanced at Mark, voice low but carrying across the silent room. You think this is over? He let out a dry chuckle. The system doesn't break because of one man. It survives, adapts. He locked eyes with Mark, something unreadable flickering behind them. You think you won, but you've only just made yourself a target. Mark didn't move as Dalton was led away. He wanted to feel relief, wanted to believe that exposing the truth was enough. But deep down, he knew Dalton was right. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Weeks had passed since Frank Dalton's arrest, but Pine Creek still felt unsettled. The scandal had ignited something in the town, a reckoning, an uneasy shift in power. The department was under intense scrutiny, with investigators combing through years of misconduct, unearthing corruption that had long been buried. Samuel Brown survived. The bullet that nearly killed him had left him weaker, but not broken. Yet, despite his resilience, he made a choice. He retired. Mark sat across from him at a small diner on the edge of town, the scent of burnt coffee lingering in the air. Brown stirred his drink absent-mindedly, his once firm hands moving slower now. You sure about this? Mark asked. Brown gave him a tired smile. I gave this job everything I had. Maybe that's enough. Mark nodded, though a part of him didn't believe it. You did the right thing, Brown added after a beat. No matter what anyone says. Mark wanted to believe that, but the truth was, he wasn't sure what the right thing even meant anymore. The department had turned against him. He wasn't one of them anymore. Not since Ia started watching his every move. But the people outside the department, the ones who had suffered under the system he had upheld for so long, they weren't ready to embrace him either. And maybe they never would. Later that afternoon, Mark stood outside Lincoln High, his hands in his pockets as he watched students filter out of the building. Jordan and Jaden Carter emerged together, their expressions guarded when they noticed him. Jordan approached first, his steps slow but deliberate. You did what needed to be done, he said, his tone careful. But tell me, have you actually changed? Mark opened his mouth, but no words came, because he didn't know the answer. Jordan held his gaze for a moment longer before shaking his head. That's what I thought. He turned and walked away, Jaden following without another word. Mark let out a slow breath. Maybe proving himself wasn't about what he had already done. Maybe it was about what he would do next. As he made his way back to his car, a scene unfolded across the street. A young black man stood beside his bike, speaking to a uniformed officer. The conversation seemed civil, at first. Then, the officer's posture shifted, his hand drifting toward his holster. Mark's stomach clenched. It was a scene he had lived through before, one he had been on the other side of. He had a choice. He could walk away, Pretend he didn't see it. Let the system continue as it always had. Or he could step in. The air was thick with possibility as Mark took a slow step forward. Then another. At the end of the day, justice isn't just about exposing one bad cop. It's about challenging an entire system built to protect the powerful. Mark Reynolds thought he was untouchable. But the truth had other plans. The real question is, how many more officers like him are out there? Hiding behind a badge? And more importantly, how many will finally be held accountable? What do you think? Can a system like this ever truly change? Or is it doomed to repeat itself? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths for more stories that uncover the reality behind the headlines.